Welcome to the Analytics Engineering Podcast, featuring conversations with practitioners inventing the future of analytics engineering.
On this episode, we're going to hear from Seth Rosen. Seth is the co-founder and CEO of TopCoat Data, which is a platform that enables companies to build customer-facing dashboards and data apps. Seth initially started working on TopCoat's product while running a data consultancy, HashPath, where he worked with dozens of clients on their data problems. While most people know Seth for his Twitter personality, he has more to offer than just great data memes. We talked with Seth about how to pick the right pieces of your data stack, whether some companies benefit from data stack in a box solutions, data meshes, and of course, the future of dashboards.
I loved hanging out with Seth. It's funny, this is only the second time that he and I have hung out before, but we interact on Twitter so often that I feel like I know him maybe better than I do. But I have such a soft spot in my heart for anybody who has done analytics consulting, and it's clear that through the years, Seth has built up such a depth of knowledge here. So it was just so much fun to hang out.
Yeah, and it's hard to not like what Seth is doing. TopCoat's deeply integrated with dbt. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Seth, welcome to the show.
Awesome. Thanks a ton for having me on. Really appreciate it.
For those of us who really have only interacted with you on Twitter before, it'll be a real shock because you're a pretty serious human in real life, but it's rare to come across a serious tweet on your feed. You've become an overnight sensation in data Twitter. You were just telling me about how this came to be, and it seems like it had something to do with sleep deprivation. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I had gone through my whole life not using social media, really never posting. And then the pandemic hit. We had a 1-month-old at home, and I was scrolling through Twitter, and I just started tweeting more. You know, I'd always send some tweets, but really just started tweeting more. And maybe it was some decisions maybe I wouldn't have normally hit send tweet on. Now I was actually sending them. So yeah, just got into it, and then got lucky with a viral tweet, which is no longer really a good term to say a viral tweet, given where we are as a country. But got lucky, and ton of people, over 2 million people saw my tweet. And
Jeez.
Then I was like, okay, this is a real thing. I'm going to keep tweeting and just have a lot of fun doing it.
That's how you got famous and have eventually started a technology company. I think that all good technology companies start with famous Twitter personas. Seriously, a lot of your humor in Twitter comes from this persona that I feel like you kind of embody as this like grizzled data professional that is kind of underestimated and maybe underappreciated. And I'm sure that like a little bit of this is to be funny and just for the likes, but I think also there's some truth in that, which is why it resonates. I'm just curious, what have you been through that has formed this persona?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real kind of shared experience among data analysts around kind of data chaos, different organizational structures, and just the experience of being a data analyst. And I think that really comes out on Twitter. Like the tweets that people really kind of latch onto are the ones where, you know, there's some shared pain around pulling data for people or inaccurate data or data chaos. And, you know, I actually came into data via product management, and I always was kind of the guy, you know, who knew the most SQL in the companies that I was working at, right? And so people would say,
it's a big mistake.
Seth,
you should never do it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's funny, but also it was probably the number one thing that kind of transformed my career, right? Being kind of the go-to person to pull data for people. And, you know, as soon as you kind of get that reputation in a company, people start coming to you, you start being put on the critical path. It got me into board meetings. It got me into a lot of different places because I was kind of the guy that was closest to the data. And since then, really just worked with a ton of different data teams as part of our consultancy, and just got into see kind of this kind of state of mind around data teams and data analysts.
That's where I was going to go next. I had not realized before, but you started HashPath, your consultancy. I don't know if you're singular or plural, but the consultancy exactly 1 month after I started Fishtown Analytics. And so I'm really interested to learn what was going on in your head at the time. Like, why did you do that? I have my own story, which has a lot to do with feeling like the tooling was ripe to get back into the role of practitioner. It just seemed like I was excited about the products out there and I wanted to be a user again. I'm curious if you were feeling any of that or it was something else.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I was a little bit less deliberate than that, in the sense that again, I came from product management and data. Really, I really split across the two throughout my whole career. And really, when I was starting consulting, and honestly, as a freelancer in the early days, I was really straddling product and data. I was kind of a somewhat of a unique area of focus for me. And so started to really work with companies that were trying to use data externally. Maybe they were building something for customers. Maybe they were trying to do data monetization, really the intersection between data and product. And it just seemed like, hey, there's really something here. Companies are struggling with this. They want to be doing more. And so hired our first person, an analyst. She was phenomenal. But then I convinced my brother to leave his job at Oracle. He'd been there his whole career, and said, hey, Josh, come on board. Let's do this. Like, there's a real opportunity.
It's a family affair.
It's a family business. Yeah, exactly. I joke that when our parents visit, it's a board meeting, because we can kind of complain to our parents about each other.
Nice. And I know that there's a pivot that is in the making much more recently, but you spent 5-ish years doing the consulting thing. What did you do? I'm sure you didn't just like do random Excel sheet generate. Like, what was your thing?
Yeah, where we focused was, taking companies at some inflection point in their growth, right? They're just scaling up, and their data team is lagging behind their organization, and they have to really kind of be doing more than what they have, and trying to help them set up a warehouse, integrate all their data together, really using all different tools to be able to do this. And then really where we ended up focusing as a consultancy was on these customer-facing data products, and really taking those to market. That could be embedded analytics, that could be building custom data applications, and things like that. And that really is where we specialized by the end, and we're doing all sorts of really interesting projects related to that.
It's interesting. I think we probably did 150 client projects over the course of the 3.5 years that we were purely a consultancy, and we did maybe a dozen of those.
Wow.
And you're like, yes, absolutely. They were often our deepest, most interesting, longest lasting client relationships. There's like so much productive work to do there. But like, not easy to find those use cases. Not every company is building that kind of a thing.
For sure. And, I think it's happening more and more, right? So there's a ton happening within embedded analytics, right? How do you take data and integrate it into your existing data application? There's an incredibly long tail of use cases. It could be agencies who need to build data products for their clients. It could be SaaS companies that are looking to use data more within their application. It could be companies who feel like their product is actually generating new data that is actually sellable and monetizable, right? And so really a lot of different use cases related to that really do span across all different sectors, types of companies, et cetera.
I was kind of curious there, because it sounds like the product you called it was white label data. That was your embedded analytics data app, so people could have custom skins for Looker. Do you think Looker is the right tool? Is there something missing there to make the like custom app or embedded analytics use case much more flawless? Or are there platforms that can be used for both internal analytics and BI, and also used for these like custom skinned app use cases?
And when you answer this, make sure to channel the sleep deprived, no filter version of yourself.
It's a great question. I would say the traditional dashboarding tools, they let you get going really quickly, right? It's easy to spin up a dashboard, put a skin on it, and give it to someone, right? That's like the shortest path to giving someone your data. But it turns out that when you're building customer-facing data products, there's things that didn't really matter for internal analytics that matter a ton for external-facing analytics, right? Things like source control, the way you deploy your dashboards, testability, things like user experience, performance matters more, right? So while it's really easy to get going and just throw up a dashboard, there's all these other things that companies realize become important once users start to use them. And someone from the user experience team says, hey, this is ugly, can we change this? And the answer is like, oh no, sorry, you can't. Like, that's just what the dashboard looks like. So you have to go build a custom application. Or maybe a 3 or 4 second load time on a dashboard is like totally fine for internal analytics. But when a customer is logging in, the CEO is like, hey, why is this slow for this customer, right? There's just a different level of rigor that you need when you're building these applications. And I do think there's a lot of catching up to do with regards to tooling. And that really, I think maybe we'll get to it later, but that was the real reason for us fully switching and focusing on our TopCoat product was trying to solve a lot of those problems.
Yeah, I definitely have noticed that there's a gap in the market there. There doesn't seem to be this like builder platform so that you can tailor the experience to a customer versus someone who's an employee, right? If you have a BI system that all your employees use and something looks wrong, you can shoulder tap or send an email or get a hold of the right person that can fix it for you. But if it needs to be customer facing, it's a whole nother level of polish that's needed. And it has to kind of work without the extra questions. So I totally agree that there's a need for that in the market.
Totally. And companies are often forced to choose, like they previously have had this decision, right? Hey, should I use this embedded dashboard where it's easy to do, you can get to market quickly, or should I hire a team of, front-end engineers, build a React app, get a designer, build a custom? Like that's a really tough decision to make, right? Because you're kind of choosing this short-term path that probably isn't gonna get you where you want to go, and then something that's really hard to maintain and expensive and tough to get right.
So before we head into TopCoat and some of the other things you're working on now, I'm curious at HashPath, a lot of the work you did was custom work, you said. And, a lot of the tools that are out there, there's tons of choices, right? Something off the shelf that you can pick. Did you find that every company was so unique that they ended up needing to go this like custom route? Did you find that there was a stack you ended up suggesting more often than not? And what was some of those advice or trends that you saw when you were talking to dozens of companies at a time?
Yeah, totally. I mean, a lot of companies were at a very early stage in kind of setting up any sort of data stack, right? So even with regards to internal analytics, they were kind of not there yet. And so they would come to us with a specific problem and they'd say, even for internal analysts, right? Because we did a lot of that as well, right? Even for internal analytics, they'd say, hey, my data's messy, people can't access it, we don't trust it. And we would go back to them and say, okay, well, I think this is what you'd have to do. And I think most people who listen to this podcast know that in the kind of modern stack, there's a ton of tools that you need. And we would go back to them and say, hey, actually, you need a warehouse. And actually, you need a tool to put data into that warehouse. And, you're better off having a tool to transform that data so you can make it analytics ready. And then we also think maybe you should change your BI tool, right? And they'd be like, whoa, that's a whole lot of tools that you're recommending for us. And so, one of the things we did is we kind of would try to convince people that actually the tooling that exists now is the easy part, right? The hard part is what are the analytics you have to build? What's the analysis you have to do? We ended up doing this quick little blog post around how to set up a data stack in under an hour, just because we were getting a lot of folks saying, well, that sounds like a lot of work. We really need that much infrastructure to do what we want to do. And we say, no, actually, luckily now that's the easy part. And the hard part is figuring out exactly, what you need to do with that data and present it. That's the real work. Luckily now the tooling on the infrastructure side gets people a lot of the way there for kind of setting up their initial stack.
I saw that video that you put out where you basically set up end-to-end analytics in less than an hour. You showed that it's not that hard to get started, right? If you have a modern stack, you pick a warehouse, you can figure out a transform layer or an ingestion layer and pick the right BI. And they all kind of work together pretty nicely where you can get up and running in not that much time. I'm curious your thoughts on some of these companies that are pushing like an all-in-one data stack in a box solution where they say, hey, you don't need to pick best of breed for each of these layers, but just consume from us and we'll handle the rest. Do you think that fits in somewhere in the market, smaller companies, or is that not really a great solution in your mind?
I'm excited to hear what you have to say to this because I've been having this fight with people via email recently. And so I hope that you disagree with me so we can fight about it live.
I think there's something incredibly overwhelming to certain companies saying you need all these tools, right? Saying, hey, go sign up with all these different vendor contracts. And once you stitch them all together, like you're going to be up and running. And so I really do think that it's probably a lower end of the market where you can have your, extraction and load layer. You can do some transformation, maybe even do some visualizations in the same tool. And you've kind of done it all really quickly. We didn't really do any of that in our consultancy, right? We had people pick, the right tool for the right part of the stack. We put them together and kind of form this data stack. But there's probably certain companies where that could be overkill. So Tristan, was that your thinking?
I feel like the opportunity space for these all-in-one players is actually pretty small. So I have scar tissue around this because the last company that I was at, called RJ Metrics, was an all-in-one platform. We did ingestion and warehousing and transformation and visualization. And the big selling point was the simplicity. We could do it all. This was back in 2012, 13, 14. And really, we were put out of business by the modern data stack. And the problem was that every one of our customers who ended up being successful, they needed more than we could provide. And so our CEO actually called it the dating app problem. Like, all of your best customers, almost by design, leave the service. And that's terrible for churn rates and everything. So anyway, if there's this whole modern data stack where there's best of breed providers and you can set the whole thing up in an hour and really can be owned and operated by a single data analyst, it feels like there's a pretty limited window for you to sell to if that level of investment is still too much for you.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think it's going to stay like that? I mean, if you look out, is this level of kind of the number of tools you need to do this right, is that going to stay this way, or will there ultimately be this consolidation and it'll swing the other way?
That's what I'm worried about. My concern is that if you look at Databricks, and I love Databricks' core product and they do a lot of really amazing stuff, but if you look at their product over the past couple of years, they've been very acquisitive. They got Redash. They've acquired a couple of different products that have made them feel a lot more like an all-in-one solution. And that worries me a little bit because that leads you to think that there's going to be a consolidation in the market. And, maybe that'll drive Snowflake to want to do the same thing and BigQuery to want to do the same thing. And then you have these separate silos of maybe they start not working with each other. It's hard to know. Maybe this is just me being paranoid, but in the early parts of my career, there was, the Microsoft stack and the Oracle stack, and you literally couldn't cross between them, even in like different jobs, because you got so familiar with one stack or the other that it was impossible to work in the other one.
Right. Or even like a Domo now, right? I mean, Domo, yep. I think early on trying to do and I think their CEO was once quoted saying, we're basically 9 startups in one, or however many he said, because they were trying to do so many things at one time, and that presents a pretty unique challenge.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there will be some consolidation, but the idea of consolidating all the way end to end, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, maybe for a really small company, you might want to use it to get started, but you'll grow out of it. I'm surprised that people don't just test it out themselves. You can get started for free with BigQuery, throw on Metabase for your BI, write a pretty simple extraction in Python, and you can get up and running in a day with very, very little experience, and you don't even have to pay, which is crazy at some levels of data. It's always been no question as to why people feel like we need this one solution to rule them all, when I think people like choice and the setup costs isn't that high in picking the tools.
For sure. And I also think in order to do that, you have to be in tune with the best tools that are out there. And I think a lot of tech companies, often they don't have the data team set up yet, right? And so maybe some of their data decisions are coming from their, core software engineering teams, where they might not be following exactly what's happening with regards to data tooling. And so they make some different decisions because of that. So the awareness, and I think that's increasing every day, but the awareness of what's out there and how easy it is to get going, I think should and needs to keep increasing.
So I guess a little bit related to having different teams pick your tools. A couple weeks back, this concept of a data mesh completely broke data Twitter. And as we've discussed, you happen to have a presence on data Twitter. Why was this such a big deal? What is a data mesh? Why should people care? Or is it totally overrated and it will be a fad that no one will revisit in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of laughing because I am an interesting person to ask this question, because I think like a lot of people trying to understand it, right? A lot of the concepts resonated, right? Especially as someone coming from product management, right? The idea of having decentralized ownership related to some particular part of the business, the idea that a team can kind of own something, treat it as a product, work independently, and not have everything totally centralized in kind of this monolith type product or team, and where there's a huge bottleneck, right? So the organizational concepts related to data mesh, I think, are awesome and make a ton of sense at a certain size organization. What I was trying to do with my tweet is I was basically thinking, well, from an organizational design perspective, it makes a lot of sense. But knowing what I know about the existing modern data stack and the tools we all know and love, how could we actually get this to work using the tools we know, right? If we kind of bought into those principles, and I don't pretend to at all be a data mesh expert, but based on my understanding, right, if we were trying to kind of implement this decentralized approach where each team kind of owns their own data end to end, treats their data as a product, how would you actually do it with the existing tooling? And so I was thinking, hey, maybe it would just be every team would have their own, DBT project, right? They would all work on their own repository. There would be, maybe using DBT packages. They'd communicate with each other. They'd end up building their own, essentially data marts in Snowflake, and they would control them. They'd own the documentation. They treat it as a product. So I was really I put the tweet out there really as a, I think Tristan, actually, I think you started it. I'm going to blame Tristan because he put out a tweet about, hey, what are the biggest questions you have related to data right now, right? And one of my questions was, hey, can you do data mesh with this existing data stack? And so I put it out there and, learned a lot from people's responses. I think that's actually one of the most underrated parts of Twitter is just hearing people's responses. And I think overall it was just, it blew up on Twitter because everyone's trying to understand it together. And there's a lot of concepts that are complex.
That was about the most kind, productive response to that I could have possibly imagined. That was not spicy at all.
Well, then I want another try.
so much of the conversation around, and you and I have been responsible for part of this, has been a little bit pointed. I'm totally with you that the idea of distributed ownership of data products is like an unvarnished good. And, I dealt with this in a recent newsletter where I was talking about how I don't feel like the DBT programming model is mature enough to really enable this right now. And the scary thing is that there's a lot of work to do before I feel like we've fully gotten there. But it's not like you can't see how this thing would come into existence. We're doing a lot of these things reasonably well, or we're starting to do them reasonably well today. So the challenge that I've had with data mesh since the beginning of it is the technical part of it. Why do we need, for the most part, fundamentally new technology paradigms to bring this thing into existence? And, sometimes I think maybe I don't actually understand the distinctions that are being drawn here. And sometimes I think that maybe people like you and I who are rolling up our sleeves and actually doing the work maybe realize something that folks in the enterprise land might not have realized yet. So I honestly don't know where to land on that one yet.
For sure. And I think data mesh is one of those things where I just kept reading and not quite getting, practically, what does this mean? Like practically, how would you implement this? And it seemed kind of a little too academic. And so trying to bring it back, okay, if you had these tools, how would you do it? I do think that is actually a productive conversation to have. Like, how would you implement this? What would the architecture look like? I know the premise separates the technology from the kind of the principles, but okay, if you had to implement it, what would the tech look like? And that's a very specific question that I don't think I fully can conceptualialize yet.
I like how you both qualify yourselves as non-experts. I think anyone who considers him or herself an expert in the space is confused themselves. It's an interesting topic. We internally also talk about what is a mono repo? Should there be multiple DBT projects in a company? A short plug for Coalesce. I'm actually working with a community member right now to talk about exactly that at Coalesce in December. But right now, we don't have the tools to make that flow as seamlessly as one would hope, but maybe that's a future that will help enable.
Hey everyone, just dropping in to let you know that the annual Analytics Engineering Conference, Coalesce, is back. We had the first Coalesce last year in December, and it was fantastic. We had 3,000 registrants, tons of presentations, and this year is going to be even bigger. Register for free at coalesce.getdbt.com.
I want to talk a little bit about data factories. Seth, you've called the companies data factories endearingly. It's a compliment in your eyes, I believe. What does it take for a company to become a data factory? What does that mean? And is there such a thing as too many dashboards in a company?
Do you mean that in a good way or in a bad way? Is it being a data factory good or bad?
Yeah, I've used the term, dashboard factory, and generally speaking, it's got a negative connotation. There are data teams that they really kind of fall into these three buckets, right? There's the data team that is just constantly turning out dashboards, just continuously. They get a new request, new dashboard, new request, new dashboard. That's kind of the data factory, right? Is just their first kind of gut reaction is I'm going to spin up a new dashboard. Now, I actually think that if you're in that mentality, there are ways you can do that right? If you have, you need to be able to make sure that when things break on various dashboards, that you keep track of where everything is, that there's logic, you need to find a way to share logic across dashboards so you're not duplicating things in the dashboard layer, right? So that's kind of bucket one, is like that dashboard factory. And then there are data teams that say, we're not going to touch dashboarding. Like, we are going to stop at the self-service layer. Like, our job is to build out a Looker Explorer. Our job is to build out this self-serve product. And then, hey, business user, or hey, stakeholder, go and do your own dashboarding. That's kind of, they've taken themselves totally out of dashboarding. And then there's like the hybrid, which I really think is the best. It's just my opinion, which is, there are the company's most important dashboards. And for those, the data team just totally obsesses over them, right? Like, they think about exactly what should be on them. They think about data presentation. They think about, what should be the right goals to display alongside this metric, right? They own those, and they treat them, like their product, and they're putting them out there for their company. Yeah, sure, there's probably other dashboarding that's happening within the company, but those are really the three camps. And so I talk about dashboard factories, where if you're going to have one of those, you better kind of really talk about quality assurance like you would in a normal factory. And if you're really just turning out dashboards without that quality assurance, well, that's not a good place to be.
If you were running an internal data team, what's your proclivity? Which version of those three do you kind of find yourself gravitating towards?
I think the data presentation layer is just critical. I think saying like, hey, we're going to stop at self-serve analytics. Like, our goal is to enable other people to like pull the data and find their own insights. And I think that's too extreme. And so, I really come from the camp saying that the data team should really work across the whole process, work with the business, be experts in the business, right? And really produce these a high quality set of dashboards that's what the business runs on, and that should be owned by the data team. So if I had to pick, it'd be the hybrid of the two.
I think the person who had the best vision on this that I've ever met, his name is Andrew. He used to be the VP of Analytics and Strategy at Squarespace. And I love the fact that those two things were combined together, analytics and strategy, because they are so related. But he was telling me one day, a while ago, about how his weekly reports to the company were kind of like the heartbeat of the company. He's like, I tell the story that everyone internally uses to understand where we are as a business and what's important and all of that. And it all flowed from the way he constructed this one core dashboard. There's like so much power in what story you're trying to tell through the data.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like the holy grail, right? That everyone knows, the North Star, what they're trying to get to. They know which dashboard they should be looking at. I think too often than not, there's just too many. People don't know which one to look at. It all feels like noise. So if you can get to that point, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, just this week, we have a lot of dashboards at DBT, as you'd imagine. All of the teams kind of produce their own. But this week, someone produced maybe a cloud dashboard, and Tristan had some commentary about what his key takeaways were, or what the story was. And that went over really well at the company, because they're like, oh yeah, like I don't necessarily see those same key takeaways as Tristan sees when he sees this data. So you want to get to a place where when you're storytelling with your dashboard, and it's not just information overload. So I think this is a good segue into your newest venture, which is TopCoat. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what TopCoat is?
Sure. TopCoat is really a way that allows analysts, right? If you can, be an analytics engineer, if you can write SQL to build these really reliable, beautiful looking data applications without needing to know a lick of JavaScript or be a software engineer, right? TopCoat really gives analysts this new ability to build really custom stuff in the front end, right? And one of the things that we found as in our consultancy, and we talked a lot about this, is this notion of needing to choose between something that was fairly unreliable, kind of rigid, ugly and then having a software engineer build you something totally custom. And so what TopCoat does is it really gives the analyst the ability to build these data applications. And I think about, kind of what DBT did and turned, someone who knows SQL into this, fully high-powered data engineer who could, unblock themselves, who could start writing modular code, who could start using, source code control, who could write their own tests, right? Really transforming that role and giving them these superpowers that they didn't have before, right? And so when I think about TopCoat, if we can channel some of that, right, and say, you know what, you can extend that, you can go all the way to the front end, you can build this awesome data application just being a data professional. That's really what we're trying to do, and we're seeing all sorts of really awesome use cases as part of that.
It sounds like it's a little bit like BI or dashboards on steroids. Do you call it, you're using the word data apps. Where is it more similar to, is it totally different than what people have used before, or is it still in that landscape of BI and dashboards?
I think when people say dashboards, I think they picture something very specific in their head, right? Maybe they picture like a very kind of grid layout with filters at the top where they change one thing, everything changes. I just think when you say the word dashboard, people's minds go to that. You can certainly do that and produce things that look like that within TopCoat, but you can also start building things with all sorts of different UI components and different user experience and change the way, you can interact with data. And so you have all of these different knobs that you can't do with a traditional dashboard. So yeah, it's definitely similar to that with kind of the ability to fully customize it. And then to the extent you want to pull in someone from your design team or you want to pull in a front end engineer, it's fully extensible to kind of truly create this application, right? Whereas maybe before you wouldn't necessarily have the right amount of extensibility or the right knobs to really do what you're trying to do.
It's been a minute since I got a demo. I don't remember, it was a couple months, but is some percentage of the code is actually stored in DBT configuration files, right? Is all the code in the meta tag of the configuration file, or is that just definition of specific metrics or something like that?
So one of the main things we're doing right now is, we're actually treating the Git repository that you use to build TopCoat. We're actually just treating that as an extension of your core DBT repository, right? So you can be building, you can do all of the, the dashboard, and you can let the user filter. You can represent all of that in code. But what that means is because we're building on top of DBT, you actually extend your DAG all the way through to the dashboard, right? All the way from DBT sources through to your DBT models, into the analysis that you're doing in TopCoat, into the dashboard that you're doing in TopCoat. You actually can fully see that DAG end to end. And you can see it in TopCoat, and then you can also, backwards import it into DBT as a package, right? And so what that really allows you to do is treat this whole system as one, right? You can make DBT changes in your data mart. You can make the associated changes in TopCoat. You can deploy that whole system as one thing together, right? Rather than trying to deploy it ahead of time, fix your dashboards or duplicate your dashboards, right? You actually are treating end to end from data source to dashboard as one thing, and you can put it through your kind of CI/CD pipeline the same way you would just your DBT repo. So there's a lot of benefits by having the two products really tightly integrated with each other.
That's awesome. Does TopCoat understand your DBT development environment? So if you're working in your local development environment, it plugs its dashboards into that. That's one of my biggest pet peeves for the workflow. If you're using basically any BI tool and you're trying to flip between models that are in production versus models that you're kind of working on in your own environment.
Exactly. Yeah, you specify the branch you're working in and whatnot, and so you can fully align it, which is, again, it came out of that exact pain that you're talking about. When you have all of these disjointed tools in your stack, you run into those kinds of problems. So the more we can deeply integrate, you start to solve a lot of those challenges.
You talk about an analytics engineer as just being a pissed off data analyst. And I think it's so true that a lot of times analysts are just underestimated and not given the tools to run. It feels like TopCoat is the next extension on the visualization layer, right? Let them do more because they can.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite kind of data analyst is the one that picks up DBT because they aren't getting what they need out of their engineering team, or they feel like they're not doing things the right way in their BI tool. And so they out of necessity learn DBT and start kind of implementing this for their organization because they've just taken it upon themselves to do that. And I think, in the front end, building these kinds of data products are things that we'll see data analysts start to do as well. And then all of a sudden, organizations are going to say, wow, look at what our data team is doing, as opposed to something that maybe has been on our product roadmap for 6 months, and just keeps getting pushed out. We can actually have our data team own this and run with it and build some really cool data products.
Okay, let me ask you something that's kind of off the wall. You and I have similar majors in college. This is going back to the thread of actually we were just separated at birth. I think you were accounting and information systems. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
So it's you're the most boring human on the planet. I was finance and information systems. I wonder if any of this data analyst with a chip on our shoulders comes from the fact that I was friends with many software engineers in undergrad, and for whatever reason, that's not the decision that I made. But I always felt like I was as smart and capable as these humans. And then going out into the world, software engineers have all this great stuff, and then analysts feel like they're put in a box. Is that what happened for you too? And if that is true, how far can you push this? Data analysts can also write the code that goes on the moon lander. Where do you stop?
To some extent, what you described was true. I mean, I think there have been numerous times in my career where I've had to go to an engineer and beg for database access. Hey, can you please give me access to the data? And they'd be like, no, our database access is for engineers. You can't have access to this, right? And so really always fighting for the ability to get your hands on the data, start participating in analytics. And I think that that's one of the really powerful things about the space right now and some of these low code tools, right? There really are a lot of things that give people superpowers, and the stuff we've talked about today is a lot of that. And I think that, you're not going to write a low code moon lander for sure, but you absolutely can write a low code data application and give your customers all the data they want, and really drive a ton of value for your company. I think it's a pretty exciting place to be for someone who knows SQL, is technical, wants to build really cool things. There's all sorts of tools that enable that for them.
I won't get into it right now, but it's interesting you use the word low code, which is a debate we've been having internally too. It's is it low code or is it just code? But it feels like the low code piece, it's I have this simple tool I have that now is so much more powerful. And I think that's what we all feel when we use SQL or we use dbt or we use tools like it, where you have to have some ramp of getting familiar with the code, but it gives you all this more power to do all the kinds of things you'd like to do.
For sure. And SQL's code, right? So, but then there's these other things that you can hang off it and do that I think do, venture into the low code territory. But it's a good debate.
To wrap up this episode, it's been a lot of fun. We ask all our guests this, but looking 10 years out, what do you hope will be true for the data industry?
It's a good question. It's a tough question. I guess my answer is I'd really love to see just every app that we use today just come with amazing analytics with it, right? It's kind of a simple one, but just even on Zoom, I would love to know within our company, hey, what % of people are talking in every meeting? Who's doing the majority of the talking? Are people, taking their video off and going on mute? Even integrated into every single application, have this data that comes along with it and make that really accessible for folks. That's something that, every tool that I use, I'm like, hey, why can't I just access this? Why can't I get my hands on this? And I'm really hoping that in 10 years, we see a lot of really amazing data products that everyone has access to and can get a ton out of.
Thanks so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks a ton for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Seth.
The Analytics Engineering Podcast is sponsored by dbt Labs and is hosted by Tristan Handy and myself, Julia Schottenstein. Have comments, questions, or guest suggestions? Email us at podcast@dbtlabs.com. Our producers are Jeff Fox and David Krevitt. If you enjoy the show, please drop a review or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening.